So welcome to this IPPR Scotland Fringe event. We're here to discuss maximising regional opportunities across all of Scotland. A really vital question, I think, at this moment in time, when the consequences of persistent regional inequalities, I think, are really staring us in the face, particularly the political consequences of allowing these inequalities to go unchallenged. I think it's important to say that this is something that all advanced economies are dealing with at this moment in time, and I think the way economies have developed, given the decline of manufacturing industries, the fact that higher level services, tradable services tend to concentrate within cities, mean that that's a challenge for all countries. I think the UK, it's important to say, has probably handled these challenges worse than most other countries. The extent that regional inequalities are really severe in the UK. You contrast how the UK has dealt with its regional inequalities with, say, Germany, who 30 years ago had to absorb East Germany, which was at a completely different stage of economic development, and managed to do so quite successfully. Even then, they're still dealing with some of the consequences of the Eastern Lander being poorer, but it's something that the UK has not dealt with particularly well. It's really interesting conversation in Scotland at this moment in time, given the scale of the economic opportunities that are facing us at this moment in time. I visited Piles and Islands Enterprise a few months ago, and we're talking about £100 billion pipeline of projects. And that's an opportunity, a likes of which we've never really faced in Scotland. But the barriers to realising that investment remain significant, really difficult issues around the skills, housing, infrastructure, etc. So the challenge, the opportunity is great for us all to see, but the challenges are really quite significant as well. So the purpose of this hour is to allow us to discuss and debate some of those issues about how we can best maximise those opportunities. So we've got a fantastic panel with us today to help discuss these issues. Shona Robison, Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government, needs no introduction to you. Get Stacey Dingwall from the Federation of Small Business, who brings a really good perspective, and my experience working with business organisations, like the FSP, is always been at the forefront of thinking about these local and regional economic issues. And finally, Ross Martin, who I'm not even going to start to begin to go through the biographies in front of me, Ross, but probably one of Scotland's most, if not most, experienced practitioner in terms of regional development issues. So we're going to go at the panel one at a time, and then after that we'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion. So Shona, if I come to you first to say a few words.
Well, thank you. I'm going to stand. I just find it easier to speak when I'm standing. And we've got our man here who's keeping an eye on the score. So if he whips up to know that we're doing well, Belarus score, we don't want to know about it. We know by your face. So, but thanks to everybody for coming tonight. It's a very long session at conference, and folk have done well to keep going at this time. I want to start by basically saying, Scotland has a fantastic story to tell. We are seen as a global leader in renewables. In fact, the PwC Green Jobs Barometer had Scotland the highest proportion of green jobs ads in the UK, tripled since 2021. So there is a fantastic opportunity there. The challenge and the theme of this fringe is really, can the benefit of all of that be shared more equally across Scotland, so that every region can benefit. Now, we are, as a government, have a major role to play in ensuring that the investments we make and the policy direction that we have are all facing in the same way. And I noticed some of the questions and challenges. All our agencies, all of our public sector organisations, are they all facing in the same direction? They certainly should be, and there's questions about whether there's things we need to do to ensure that they are, whether that's our skills landscape or our enterprise agencies, or our local authorities, and so on and so forth. So we have, sometimes, I get a little bit frustrated about some of the economic narrative about Scotland, because you hear a lot of negativity about Scotland's economic performance, but actually Scotland's economy grew by 67% in real terms between 1990 and 2022, and at the same time we cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half, showing that actually you can tackle the climate emergency, but at the same time have a growing and thriving economy. They can go hand in hand. And as I said at the start, Scotland is now seen as a global leader in renewables. We have, through Scotland revenues, seen a reinvestment, an ongoing reinvestment of the 756 million that we've had from Scotland revenues. Those revenues are able to reinvest in our infrastructure to make sure that we can deliver the opportunities across Scotland. We have supported over 3,000 jobs and over £168 million of supply chain spend in Scotland. Through the work of SNP, we've seen investment secure the Haventus project to regenerate Ardisia port, which is the largest dedicated offshore wind deployment port in Scotland, with the potential creation of 3,000 jobs and reskilling opportunities. We've seen the Sumitomo cable factory in Nigg, the investment securing 330 jobs and 350 million inward investment. And then we have the Cromarty Firth Green Freeport, with the potential to become Scotland's renewable energy powerhouse, with the ability to attract inward investment to stimulate innovation and growth. Things that all of these things have in common is they're all in the Highlands and Islands, and actually there is something about the green reindustrialisation of our Highlands and Islands and the repopulation of our Highlands and Islands being the focal point. And given the depopulation issues that we've seen in our Highlands and Islands, it is a real opportunity that, whether it's at Ardisia, whether it's at Nigg, whether it's at Cromarty Firth, Shetland Islands, Western Islands, all huge developer interest based around offshore wind that is seeing some major pipeline of developments there, and those are very exciting indeed. But it's not, and I'll come back to the Highlands and Islands in a second. We're also though seeing interventions that are important interventions to maintain important infrastructure and jobs that are already there. So the investment led by Kate Forbes in Alexander Dennis, keeping those jobs in the Falkirk area, the work done on Project Willow at Grangemouth, the Just Transition Fund, the 500 million over 10 years in this neck of the woods in Aberdeen North East, to make sure that the skills of the oil and gas sector are kept in Scotland, because those skills are absolutely the same skills that we need for the renewables sector, directly transferable. So that's all the good stuff. That's all the real opportunity and good stuff. So where are the challenges? So the challenges are around making sure that that opportunity benefits all parts of Scotland. And we have seen a bit of a kind of east-west divide, where you've seen the east of Scotland major population growth, housing growth, infrastructure. The west of Scotland quite a depopulation, which we have to look at and address in terms of our economic strategy and investment strategy. But going back to the Highlands and Islands, and the challenges that I am told about is that all this investment is absolutely fantastic, but do we have the housing, transport, skills available to us to make sure that those opportunities can be harnessed in the way that they need to be? So, and I should actually add into that digital, because digital connectivity in the Highlands and Islands to do business, and if people are going to go and live and work there in great numbers, is going to require that digital connectivity. So we are investing in things like the R100 programme to make sure that we can connect parts of Scotland, particularly those most rural areas. On housing, so I was speaking to folk involved in the Cromarty Firth developments, and actually the thing they always tell me is that housing is the major challenge in that area. They're going to need thousands of new homes, and how do we make I'm not for a minute suggesting that the public sector should step into that space and build and pay for the building of all of these homes when there are well-paid jobs that will be available in those areas. But we can be a catalyst for investment in housing. We can make sure the planning system supports it, and that we give confidence to the private sector to go and build the right homes in the right areas to support that inward migration to Cromarty Firth and elsewhere. And the same could be said for the Western Isles, another good example. Some of the developers there in the Western Isles are actually developing their own housing for the workforce. Now that workforce is going to be there for a while, but not on a permanent basis, and what they've said is that they will then convert that housing into affordable homes for local people. So that is all good, but we need to make sure that it all aligns in terms of the investment, the planning system, and that we get all of that aligned to take advantage of this repopulation. Transport, which we have the Transport Secretary in the room, I'm very conscious what I say here to make sure I am on message, but Fiona Hislop and Transport Scotland very, very focused on all of this. So we're focused on the arterial route into the Highlands in terms of the investment into the A9. We're also investing in our ferry fleet. We're also, and not just for passenger use, but we have to think about freight. So how does all of these components for the offshore wind sector and all of the infrastructure, how does it get to the Western Isles, the Shetlands, and so the freight capacity needs to be thought about, because it will need to be enhanced for sure, to make sure that again we can get the materials to where they need to be, and the supply chain opportunities there for smaller businesses absolutely critical. And then there's the issue of skills. Someone said to me on my visit to the Western Isles that we could probably employ every single young person leaving school for the next decade and we still wouldn't have enough people. Now, that is a challenge. Now, some of that needs to be addressed by our own skills agencies. We need to make sure that Skills Development Scotland, our schools, our colleges are making sure young people know of these opportunities and are going and are training in the opportunities that are there. But we also have opportunities for our older workforce to reskill and move into these growing sectors. But even with all of that, we will need people to come and move to work here in Scotland to fill some of these jobs, particularly the highly skilled jobs that will take years of training to fulfill. And that means we need in-migration into Scotland. Now, we have already net in-migration into Scotland from elsewhere in these islands. More people are coming, including working age, to live and work in Scotland than are leaving, and that is a good thing. But we need to have routes, and for example, we have put forward the rural visa pilot, where we could have a route into the Highlands and Islands through a rural visa pilot for people who want to come and live and work in our Highlands and Islands. And we've been pushing the UK government for that. So far, we have not managed to land that, but we will continue to make the case, because we want people to come live, work and contribute in Scotland and in our Highlands and Islands in particular. Now, I'll finish really by saying this. We have, I think, one of the most exciting opportunities that we have seen in decades for the repopulation of parts of our country that young people have felt they've had to leave their communities to find opportunities elsewhere. It is such an exciting prospect that areas of our Highlands and Islands will become magnets for people to go and not just stay living in those communities, but for people to come and live and make their lives in communities across our wonderful country. But we have a responsibility as the Scottish Government, along with others. UK Government has a role here as well, obviously, but we have a responsibility to make sure that we have the infrastructure, that we are thinking ahead, to make sure that we join the dots and make it easy for businesses to come and locate here. We make it easy for people to come and live and work in the communities where there are these opportunities. And that I know is one of the subjects we're talking about this evening. We have done a lot, but there is more work to be done, and I look forward to the ideas from the panel and in the room in that space. So thank you for the opportunity, and thanks to the organisers for the Fringe meeting tonight.
Thanks, Shona. That's such a helpful introduction. You spoke about so many issues there. I'm sure we'll want to get back to through questions. I think the point you made about your frustration with economic narratives is one that many of us will share in Scotland, and all nuance is lost. I think the point you made about that story about positive net migration into Scotland at the moment is something we don't talk about enough.
Yeah.
And I think on a regional basis, you would be correct to draw attention to the growing east-west disparities. But even within the West, there's so much good things happening around about Glasgow and energy, financial services, creative industries, etc. So we need to put that in. Anyway, Stacey.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for the invitation to take part today. So for those of you who don't know who FSB are, we are the voice of small businesses and the self-employed in Scotland. So I work for the Scotland team, but FSB is national and across the other devolved nations. In the last count, there were just over 350,000 small businesses in Scotland, so that's making up about 90% of our economy, so pretty much all of it. And these businesses are also employing around 900,000 people and turning over 93 billion annually, so you can see there's a lot of power across our membership. Some of you here are probably self-employed yourself or own a small business. If you don't, then I'm sure that you know someone in your friends and family, and you'll certainly know all the local small businesses in your communities. I'm sure everyone's got their favourite ones that they spend too much money in. And you'll know, whether it's friends or family, or just from speaking to those people that own those businesses in your communities, how tough the last few years have been for small businesses, just to keep things going, to be honest. So at the start of the year, FSB carries out a kind of national survey of our members every 2 years, and we ask them for their views across a range of different topics, like trades and conditions, high streets, future ambitions, and then some more topical things like visitor levies, energy, that kind of thing. So when we got the results back, the challenges did come through loud and clear, as we would have expected. Things around access to skills, finance, rising costs, obviously a particular challenge for a lot of our members, including hospitality, retail, leisure. But despite all that, it was quite encouraging to see that just over half of the respondents to that survey told us that they were planning to grow their business in the next 2 years, which was obviously really encouraging in terms of some of the economic narratives that we've touched on already. So FSB, our focus is really working with our members and government to try and find some practical solutions to growth barriers and challenges that our members tell us that they're facing, and that's both nationally and at a more local and regional level as well. We've already touched on skill shortages, a massive issue for some of our members, and again particularly in Highlands and Islands, and that's why we're actually really supportive of the rural visa pilot scheme that you mentioned there, as a means of addressing some of those challenges that our members have seen in the Highlands and Islands, particularly post-Brexit, as you can imagine. For our members, that lack of access to staff means that those that want to grow, they're actually being forced to cut their hours or their service offering instead, because they don't have access to that local skills base. Apprenticeships is also a big area in terms of increasing the number of apprenticeships that small businesses take on. So at the moment, only about 25% of our members have ever taken on an apprentice, and again, government is now looking at that through the tertiary bill and making the system better for small businesses, which is something we've really backed in terms of increasing that skills base for our members. Another thing
Thanks, Stacey. I was just thinking, I was in a cafe in Glasgow a couple of Sundays ago reading the Sunday papers and depressing the living daylights out myself, getting reading about the riots and the popular strike, etc. But I left the cafe and it was the day the Great Scottish Run was happening in Glasgow. There was kind of thousands of happy people were seeing, and then went a walk down the bars and the number of kind of new small businesses opening up around the bit outside the road. I mean, they're just so important to making cities livable and great places to stay. So it's about that social importance as well as economic importance as well. Anyway, on to Ross. As I say, I'm not going to try and cover Ross's biography, but in the note I have in front of me, it says Ross is an advisor on regional economies, assisting governments at all levels in the curation of policy frameworks and practical policy intervention. So, in making your introductory comments, Ross, anything you could do to kind of describe the current policy frameworks and practical interventions? I know it's a complex landscape, but anything you can do to help the audience kind of navigate that, I think would be
Okay, thanks very much, Stephen, and hello everybody. I'm going to start with a misquote, actually, a misquote of James Carville from the 92 Clinton campaign. It's the regional economy stupid. And that's essentially a reading of Stephen's articulation there of the critique of the UK and therefore the Scottish economy over the past, well, over the post-war period really. And it's a criticism which the OECD has levelled at the UK and Scotland entirely over that period, and led to us, when I was at SCDI, now called Prosper, to publish the blueprint for Scotland's economy in 2015 in the wake of the fiscal transfer, and the Scottish Government beginning to get some of the economic powers and levers which it clearly needs and demands. And that particular piece of work focused on those engines of the national economy, otherwise known as our regions. And Shona's point around how do we reorganise and restructure within that in order to put as much fuel into the tanks of the regional economies, otherwise known as the public service reform agenda, looking at the alignment of whether it's in Fiona's area in regional transport partnerships, or whether it's in the skills area with regional skills and employability plans, or whether it's the college sector, or wherever you look, people live their lives at the regional scale, and we saw that really come to a real sharp focus during the depths of the COVID crisis, partly driven by how governments were expecting people to behave and conditioning how we behaved, but we've seen it really flourish, if you like, in the period since, as people redo the way they work. So that old pattern of Monday to Friday commuting into the city, going back out to dormitory towns, gone. We still have an element of that for sure, and the transport providers like First see the shift in patterns in terms of how people use the transport network. The ScotRail network was really built and constructed originally around that morning peak, and ScotRail have done an amazing job in rejigging that and being able to accommodate as they electrify the fleet, as they modernise the rolling stock, as they differentiate the services that they run. They've done an amazing job being able to not just catch up with where the public are at, but get ahead of where the public are heading. If you forgive that pun, you always end up with puns in transport field, don't you? But being able to do that on a regional basis, because that's where people live, work and play. And so we've seen that shift in pattern. And the other thing that we've seen, and this is something that's been in the offing for the last, 25, 30 years, both governments now understand that regional proposition and the importance of regional devolution from both governments down to the region, but also in terms of taking up some of the powers from the local level as well. So I'm going to do a kind of picture across each of the 8 regional economies in the country, just to give you a little snippet of what's happening, and an appreciation of the other element of that national coherence is the need for not just a grudging acceptance of regional diversity, but a value to that regional diversity, because in that diversity we get the strength of the Scottish economy as a whole. So when you look at each of the 8 regional economies across Scotland, they all play different roles. They're not trying to ape each other, they're not trying to compete with each other. And you can see in the public service reform agenda, whether it's the regionalisation of colleges, as an example, as a former chair of a college in 4th Valley, I saw this acutely, you can see that regionalisation of effort is based on the characteristics of that regional economy, and they're different in the different parts of the country, and they serve different needs. And so the skills base, for example, has different needs and requirements in different parts of the country, just as the transport sector does. So if you take each of those 8, let's just go through them and get a little snippet to see how they're doing and take the temperature, if you like, on that road to regional working, and really being able to empower those regional engines of the economy. So let's start with, so I'm going to go through the 8. I'm not going to test you all as to whether you know the 8. I'll run through them quickly and then come back to each of them. So Ayrshire, the borderlands, tricky one, I'll come back to that. The capital city region, anybody ever hear it getting called the capital city region? I'll come back to that. The Forth Valley, Glasgow's metropolitan city region, with an emphasis on the metropolitan. The Highlands and Islands, the North East, it needs a new name, and Tay Cities, very clever rebranding on Tay Cities from Tayside. And I'll come back to that element as well. So if we start in Ayrshire, and you look at what's happening in Ayrshire, anybody here from Ayrshire? Obviously. Originally from Ayrshire. But at the moment, we have a fragmented landscape of the public sector in Ayrshire. With 3 local authorities, nobody knows what the boundaries are. And if you travel down the A737 from East Renfrewshire, then you go into North Ayrshire, you keep travelling south, and you go into East Ayrshire, keep travelling south, you go into South Ayrshire, keep travelling south, and where do you end up? You end up back in North Ayrshire. It's just, that local government reform was done for specific political purposes, and it doesn't make sense. Now, I'm not suggesting that we reform local government. I'm suggesting that each of those local authorities need to collaborate more. They need to collaborate more with their college. There was a single college in Ayrshire, and they need to collaborate with the health authority and the single health authority, and they are doing that. So, for example, across Ayrshire, you're now seeing economic development, transport and planning beginning to be organised at that regional level because it makes sense to do it in that way. And so that's a bottom-up approach, which is being driven there. It's not people in the civil service or in government sitting there pulling levers and saying, this is the way we think things should be. When I was in government, putting the architecture together for all of this stuff in the regional economy division, we never drew any lines on maps. We invited each of the regions to come forward and self-assemble. And they came forward as naturally as you would expect, and what we would all expect. And so Ayrshire is one of those significant units. Sure, it has a particular relationship with the Glasgow city region, the metropolitan region, city region of Glasgow. And we used to joke when I was in there about, I joke with my colleagues in Ayrshire when talking about this. If you walk through Central Station on the morning from the Gordon Street entrance at the front to the Argyle Street entrance at the back, if you walk, during what's left of the peak morning rush, you'll see a big chunk of Ayrshire's GDP walking towards you, because it does have that relationship with the Glasgow city region, and that needs to be borne in mind. But nonetheless, they need to organise themselves on that regional basis, and they're doing that. And then you look across to the borderlands, and you're beginning to see, because of the work of the South of Scotland Enterprise, which was created on the back of the Enterprise and Skills Review, beginning to see that coherence across the South of Scotland and over the border into the reorganised elements of the north of England. And a real opportunity to recognise that that's how people live their lives, and that there needs to be porosity between the two. If you were to ask a cop during the depths of the COVID crisis, when we had all the travel restrictions on, if you ask them, did you really police the border between Scotland and England? Not a chance. I mean, you would have cut people's lives in half by doing that. And so we need to be able to recognise that in the economy, and we need to organise our services accordingly. And the borderlands are beginning to do that through the work of South of Scotland Enterprise. And then over into the capital city region, nobody calls it the capital city region, and it drives me absolutely bonkers. I grew up in Western Hales on the edge of Edinburgh. And to me, it has been, it always will be the capital city. And it needs to be called that and recognised that. There's an international effect of a city being the capital. We wouldn't have the Queensferry crossing, I would argue, and we wouldn't have Dunfermline East, I would argue, if Edinburgh hadn't exported some of its growth over the river. You wouldn't have a lot of the growth in East, Mid and West Lothian if Edinburgh hadn't exported its growth out into the Lothians. And so there's a genuine effect of Edinburgh being the capital, both within that city region, but also in the country as a whole. And so it's beginning to grasp that, it's beginning to get its head around that. And so if you look, for example, the next big phase of development around Edinburgh is 20,000 houses on the outside of the city bypass, and for the first time. And that growth between the airport and Heriot-Watt University's campus is the first real opportunity for a planned urban expansion of Edinburgh since the New Town. And to do it properly, according to NPF 4 and the planning regime, to do it on an infrastructure first basis, and to put that infrastructure in at the same time, to do it as an integrated package rather than 5 or 6 separate planning applications and individual developments. So you've got that happening in the capital city region. You've got other elements. I'm conscious of time, so I'll not go through all of the regions. But if you just take the Forth Valley and what's happening in the Forth Valley, sure, Petro Ineos closing the petrochemical facility at Grangemouth is a massive shock to the system, but it's also an enormous opportunity in the Forth Valley to decarbonise. And there is all sorts of fantastic work going on through Project Willow and much further across the Forth Valley. For example, the creation of a micro-electricity grid powered by renewables to power all the big off-takers along the Forth, including the likes of Superglass and Lye, etc., and even potentially the university campus. So there's a whole opportunity there arising out of that particular transition. And that's a characteristic of the Forth Valley economy, which doesn't exist in any of the aforementioned ones. And if you look across each of the other regions, you see that kind of regional activity starting to come through, but it's authentic to each region. And it looks at what are the strengths of this particular region, what are the local characteristics which make up that region, and how do we build on them in order to build a platform for future growth and future sustainability. And I loved Shona's point at the start there about economic and environmental sustainability being two sides of the same coin, is a phrase that I often use. You simply cannot have one without the other anymore. It is just not possible to have economic sustainability unless you do environmental sustainability as well. They are not competing interests. They are two sides of the same thing, and they are mutually dependent upon each other. And if we can get that right through the national coherence element, get the regions right through the regional diversity, then we're onto something.
Fantastic. It's really helpful, Ross. I'm happy to report that the football correspondent in the front row has informed us he's got the run up against We have about 20 minutes left, so we'll just open the floor to questions and see how much we can cover. Anyone like to ask a question?
How do we address, sorry, I'm Jim Rutherford from my ledger at Collinsay branch. How do we address even though when we get high paid jobs, it's obviously good to have high paid jobs, high skilled jobs with that. How do we address the inherent inequality that brings to places that haven't had high paid jobs in that area before, when it then may take away from jobs that are essential but not well paid, especially when it's not public sector, maybe it's just sort of businesses like Royal Mail, supermarkets that don't really care about places that are a bit further out as much as sort of public space, or we do have control over pay, and we can't sort of compel them without the powers of their independence, obviously, to pay more to stop the recruitment issues. And obviously, in Ireland in particular, there's limited recruitment pools as well. So it's sort of, how do we address that? Because high paid jobs are really welcome, but they do bring inequality as well.
That's a good question. Maybe take a couple of questions.
Yes.
So,
Me?
you go first.
First of all, I just wanted to say fantastic news about the rail freight depot in Inverness. Fantastic. It's a fantastic thing. But I wanted to know I'm a councillor in Aberdeen, so I want to know what your vision is for my area.
Okay.
Hi, Brandon Jones from First Bus. I'd like to ask about connectivity. So, of that economic growth story, and the infrastructure fund announcement recently, £20 million, is really welcome. So that's been fantastic news. My question really is looking ahead, is to be able to leverage even more private investment. It's really healthy and supportive to have that public investment look ahead, particularly multi-year, kind of longer term funding. So looking ahead, can you tell us any more about the bus infrastructure fund news? I appreciate, I'm not asking for a number here, but that kind of longer term commitment around infrastructure funding, and then how that can leverage private investment is really strong, and a really positive story that we certainly like to work with the government on.
Excellent question. Shona, you?
Well, so Fiona might want to come in as some more detail here, but Fiona and I both like buses. We talk about buses a lot, and they are a very important means of connectivity, particularly gentleman's point there about those who are potentially who are suffering from inequality, who perhaps don't have car ownership. But actually, for modal shift, we want to get people out of their cars onto buses. So there's been a lot of work, obviously, with some of our concessionary schemes, and getting young people used to using buses who are under 22s, and so. But your point about reliable services. So in rural Scotland, there is a challenge. So even we make bus travel more affordable, more attractive, there's actually got to be the infrastructure network there. So we're thoughtful of that. Budget is on the 13th of January, and I'm not going to kind of, even though you're showing us scores and all of that in football, you're not going to persuade me to give it. But all I would say is, look, we recognise the importance of buses and bus connections. Very thoughtful about how do we ensure quality, reliability. In my own home city, the fleet of electric buses have proven to be popular, but we need to get people using buses more, and we need to make sure that the network is reliable, and rural issues need to be looked at in terms of connectivity. By the way, I came to a conference on the bus from mine, and it was a great experience. Anyway, I digress. So the issues about inequality, and how do we make sure that economic opportunities reach everybody? Now, Stacey was talking about the small business opportunities, and there are huge opportunities for our small businesses, whether it's in the supply chains for our growth sectors, but also when you have people coming and living and working in areas that are growth areas, then you get all of the other opportunities around hospitality, around service sector and all of that. Interestingly, the hospitality sectors in rural Scotland, some of them have been telling me that they're having to pay higher wages in order to attract staff. So there is something about the kind of skill shortage does sometimes drive wages, and we've done a lot in the real living wage space to try and drive wages to a real living wage level. But on the other hand, we've also heard from Stacey about the challenges of rising costs, whether it's energy costs, ENIX costs, all of the things that have come as headwinds to small businesses. So in the regional economic partnerships and plans that there are, we absolutely need to make sure that the opportunities reach into folk who are currently not in the labour market, also young people who have maybe not had the best opportunities, that our skills sector is supporting them to ensure they have opportunities. I remember meeting Aberdeen about the opportunities they were creating for young people in financial services, young people who had never thought about working in financial services ever, but they had to go and reach out because schools weren't talking about these opportunities. Young people didn't know, and they had to look at different criteria for young people because they weren't meeting the kind of traditional number of Nat 5s or hires, but they said they were some of the best staff that they'd ever recruited into financial services because they were hungry to learn and eager to get on. So, you know, I think our sectors have to think beyond the traditional routes. And finally, yeah, so I talked about the Just Transition Fund, the 500 million over 10 years. We need to make sure we keep the oil and gas skills. I mean, the oil and gas sector, incidentally, has, you know, a number of decades to run, and we're also, you know, really pushing the UK government around the fiscal regime. Met a guy in the Hilton Bar who was a senior person at BP, who they were away down to meet with Ed Miliband, and well, I'll not repeat what he said about Ed Miliband, only that, you know, the UK government absolutely has to change the fiscal regime to ensure that, you know, we extract out of the oil and gas sector the years that they're still to run, but meantime that we work on that transition, because the skill set is the same required for the renewable sector. So there is the absolute opportunity there, but we need to get it right, and we don't want a cliff edge of those skills being lost to Scotland, people leaving and going to work elsewhere in the global market in oil and gas. We need to keep those skills here.
Yeah, it'd be good if we had instead of 31 jobs in London for GB Energy and 13 here, it was the opposite way
Oh,
around.
well, look, all I'll say about that, because I know there was a fringe meeting about this, is, you know, it was oversold in terms of what was coming when, and then, you know, and all of that. You know, we welcomed GB Energy, but, you know, there was a hype around it that, of course, you know, the leadership team, they were like, oh my God, you know, we're never going to. But, you know, it absolutely needs to align with what is required, and it needs to, you know, develop and get, you know, their sleeves rolled up in making some of this happen. And, you know, we need to do that as well. But, you know, they are, you know, they promised a lot for this city and need to be held to account for delivering some of that ambition. So I'll stop here.
Ross, we'll come to you in a minute. I know you've got an Aberdeen question to deal with. But Stacey, I mean, I thought that first question there really gets to the heart of a lot of what we think about economic development. And I guess the assumption over the years has been that government should focus on those high skills, high productivity jobs, and that will help drive demand throughout the rest of the labour market. But I think over the last 10 years or so, there's been a recognition that there is a gap out there, and we've seen all the agendas about the foundational economy, the everyday economy, etc. I think the London agenda kind of links into that as well. I know FSP have been heavily involved in all of this, and maybe FSP will really drive the foundational economy agenda. So if you get any reflections, particularly on that first question.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question, because I think it actually gets to the heart of a lot of the things that we say to government all the time is, you know, understandably there's always a focus on, you know, these kind of high growth tech scalar chasing unicorn type companies, which obviously is a good thing to do, but I think you often, sometimes those, we've kind of been calling them the missing middle, those businesses that, you know, either just want to sustain where they are just now or grow modestly. Maybe we just forget about them, and, you know, a lot of our members unfortunately feel a wee bit overlooked and not loved in terms of, you know, because they're not shiny. So it's about getting it right for those kind of businesses. You know, I think a lot of people think that our member, you know, small business owners are all absolutely loaded driving about in Rolls Royces and stuff. That's absolutely not the case. You know, they're just wanting to, you know, it's a lot of our members tell us that, you know, they're the last person to get paid once they've paid their staff. They take ultimate, you know, loads and loads of pay cuts just to keep the business going. So it's making sure that, you know, we don't overlook those businesses that are making up 98% of our economy. And another point you touched on, the economic connectivity, the focus can always be on getting people into those jobs, when actually self-employment might be a better route for those people instead of work for a job. And that's not just me trying to increase the number of potential FSB members. It's just self-employment is a better fit for people who are economically inactive. So yeah, it's just a plea to don't forget about our kind of everyday small businesses.
Thanks, Stacey. Ross, interested in your reflections on other points, but if you could address that, but we're expecting nothing less than a plan for Aberdeen's economy in the next 5 minutes.
I'll try my best.
Oh, you think the name? We need a new name.
I'm going to come to the Aberdeen thing, but just as a wee aside, since you mentioned GB Energy, anybody noticed that each of the new organisations being created by the UK government is now being called GB? GB Energy.
The point was made at lunchtime,
etc. Yeah. So, you know, given the nature of this part of the conference, and particularly yesterday's debate, then it's worthwhile seeing where the UK civil service are heading in terms of factoring in what might happen just over the water in 2030. And I think it's really important because these people play long term, and change, as another party might say, is happening already. So in terms of Aberdeen and the North East, needs a new name, right? It used to be called Grampian, but that's verboten. Tayside is really cleverly rebranded as Taysides. You might say a fresh start.
Fresh start.
For Tay Cities, really clever though the way they did that. To bring Dundee and Perth together, and not to see one as in the shadow of the other. But Aberdeen in the North East, to the rest of the country at the moment, is called Aberdeen in the North East, and I think it kind of speaks to what's been a period over the oil and gas, over the main chunk of the oil and gas period, a pretty individualistic view of life, if you like. This part of the UK, you'll not be surprised to hear, has the highest percentage of personalised number plates outside Kensington and Chelsea.
Famously.
Right? And it says something about the way people act. And so my view of Aberdeen in the North East is that it needs to be much more collective and coherent. So if you take the Aberdeen City, what was the Aberdeen City and Shire, and the work that was done with the Aberdeen City and Shire Economic Forum, which became Opportunity North East, based on the Australian model, which we brokered with the folks from Perth. And you look at the work being done as the prototype, if you like, for the Regional Economic Partnership, which is Opportunity North East, and the extra money that was announced yesterday with First Minister and Enud. So you're beginning to see the coming together of the region around a shared prospectus. And if you take the three pillars of NSET, the National Strategy for Urban Transformation, if you take the three pillars of place, people and connectivity, you're beginning to see programmes coming through in terms of that. But there's one part of this city which drives me bonkers, which I would love to see symbolising the next phase of the development of this part of the country. And that's that ludicrous setup where you have the rail station, Union Square, the bus station, the back end of the bus station, and then the port, in an area which should be a model for integrated and intermodal transport, at the heart of the rebirth of the city centre. And there's a massive opportunity to do something pretty special there between the public and the private sectors. In a city which saw, roughly speaking, 17% of UK corporation tax, 17% of entire UK corporation tax essentially flow through this city for 35 years. And none of it spent on that infrastructure. And it's time Aberdeen got its turn from UK government and Treasury in terms of putting some of the money back into that. So I would love that to symbolise the coming together of Aberdeen and the North East, and to demonstrate its birth into the next phase of its development.
And we need time for another round of questions, but we have the Transport Secretary in the room, so we'll be here to have a chance to contribute.
Is there any Aberdeen councillors here? Because that's what they're wanting to do. The whole point is,
exactly.
So it's not that it's not been thought of and not been wanted. Actually, and I was there 2 years ago when we were doing all this work. So I think it's fair to say actually the SNP and the administration there are on the case.
Yeah.
So to be fair, is that.
It needs both governments to come in behind it.
It does, and the National Wealth Fund, where loads of the billions of investment, capital investment, financial transaction investment, it's very opaque how we have no line of sight of how much is Scotland going to get of that infrastructure investment. We're absolutely trying to get a handle on that and push the case for big investments, whether it's in Aberdeen City Centre or many other areas that we would want some of that money to go to, but it's very opaque. We're trying to get SNP as a puffin and all the rest of it to route some of that money through, but it's pretty opaque, and I worry that what we end up seeing is just picked projects that have been picked for political reasons rather than a strategic investment for economic growth and transition, which would be an absolute scandal.
Absolutely. Douglas Alexander's first announcement as Secretary of State I know I should mention he's been here, but his first announcement was essentially to create 20 million pots of funding with Union Jacks on them to plonk them around the
Yeah.
It's
Well,
absolute madness.
worse
And
than
it's a
that,
waste of money.
that was not just a waste of money, it's our money. So that 500 million should have been routed through Scottish Government,
Completely.
and it has been siphoned off through the Internal Market Act for pet projects that backbench Labour MPs then get to announce.
Yeah.
It is what the Tories did with the famous roundabout in the Borders that was badged. It was, they paid for a roundabout and it had a kind of paid for by the UK government. Nobody needed the roundabout, but there it is, and it's just not a strategic good use of the collective public money we have available. And just absolutely, I know, well, you can tell, probably annoys me a little bit, because we always hear this thing about, you know, the best use of public resources, and yet here we are back to the pet projects, and so anyway, rant over.
Squeeze a few more questions in. The lady at the back.
Hi, thanks, Stephen. Shona, I think it was you that said that often economic growth in an area is hindered by a lack of housing. And I mean, we're in Aberdeen where in the 70s Shell built a whole load of houses in Nig for their workers. And I was in Buckie recently on the Murray Coast, and there's a whole new housing estate there, which has been built by SSEN to house workers for upgrading the grid. And I just wondered if there's a role for government or some agencies to bring together the smaller stakeholders who can't afford to build themselves the housing, but you know, a public agency could maybe get them together to put some private money in, maybe with some help from government, because we want more roads, more houses, to kind of kickstart the housing, which then can kickstart the economy.
One more question.
Thank you. I live in Edinburgh here as an exhibitor, so no branch. I'm interested in the granularity of all of this, in particular, I guess, how the small businesses. I live in North Edinburgh. There's been a lot of development that's happened. I've obviously seen a lot of flats going up. I don't see terribly much happening by way of community or the people who are supposed to live in those flats. You know, they're just going to the city centre and enjoy the lights of Princess Street Gardens and nothing else. So it's about how the planning process is going to introduce a granularity. I see some bright spots on the horizon. I was thinking the concept of a place plan is something there that it could, in time, but it will take time to sort of come in. But also how to engage with smaller businesses in particular, and how, to some extent, regulation makes less sense at a smaller scale. You know, there's some regulatory requirements at a smaller scale of this mind-boggling, whereas for a multi-billion company, it's what dropped back. So it is how that regulation and how you engage, how the public engages, so that at the end of the day you have a quality of life for all the people who live in these areas, and not simply, yes, we have a housing problem, but not just a whole bunch of boxes, those people get on plus roads on.
It's really a lesson we should have learned in Scotland by now. I mean, you look at what happened with Glasgow's peripheral schemes, lots of housing, no amenities, the whole thing was a disaster. So we're very tight for time, so if we just ask the panel for any thoughts on those final two questions, or any final reflections you might have, Stacey.
It's very expensive to have a business premises these days, you know, in terms of rent, non-domestic rates, all those kind of things. So we're actually seeing fewer and fewer of small businesses, you know, they do it from home, quite a lot of them, because it is just too private for them. You know, you think about the issues that we have in town centres, and we need that kind of regeneration, lots of empty units, I'm sure we're all used to seeing that, but it just doesn't make financial sense for them to have premises. The point you made there about regulation is really important through the New Deal for Business, which we were heavily involved in over the last 18 months. We made a bit of progress in terms of through the
Ross, I'll come to you next and let the Cabinet Secretary wind up.
Okay. Just on housing, housing is key economic infrastructure as well as the place where we live, and has to be seen as that, not as something separate, which it has been traditionally in local government with housing revenue account, etc. And so that needs to be brought. I was going to say needs to be brought in house, but I better not say that. And what we're seeing in the opportunity of West Edinburgh, as an example, is to do that properly and to put all of that infrastructure in first, and at the same time as you develop it out. And so if you look across to the other side of the country, to the Glasgow city region, then the creation of the metro integrated transport system is going to be a big driver for where housing will be able to go and be attractive to go. And so, you know, if you think of, if you go back to the Connectivity Commission report, then there's a lovely picture in the Connectivity Commission report, which you know well, Fiona, which overlays the SMID areas in the public transport network. Shock horror, the people who are most distant from the labour market are the people who need to take 2 buses to get anywhere, right? So fix the transport network in a way which is integrated, enable people to get to work, makes the housing areas more attractive, but make housing not the soulless places where I grew up, monolithic housing estates, whether they're public sector or private sector, integrate them properly and create communities which have that community sense and that community heart right at the centre of them.
Thanks, Ross. Shona?
Yeah, just 3 final points on the point Stacey was making about regulatory impact and having a small business lens to that. That's absolutely right, but we're also having a review of regulation and asking ourselves questions about, you know, do we need all the regulation that we do have? Now, some of that regulation will be very important, but there is some that it's just, you think, what's the purpose of that? Why do we do that? Why is it so complex? And so I think there's some opportunity there, and that's been led by Kate Forbes. On Maureen's question about housing, you know, absolutely we want to encourage the big players, the SSENs and others to you know, get their sleeves rolled up and get the provision of housing absolutely delivered, but bearing in mind what we just said, you don't want just in the middle of nowhere, you want communities built around the new housing that is coming and will come. The smaller developers, I would see organisations like Highlands and Islands Enterprise being important to coordinate there. They've taken a very active interest in housing because they see it as a key impediment. But they've also talked about, which will come on my final point, about place-based approaches. It's not just about boxes, it's about business opportunities, it's about transport, it's about community facilities, health facilities, schools, and just that sense of place. And actually the gentleman here, one of a good example is at Granton, where we've worked with Edinburgh City Council around taking a place-based approach to Granton. So it's not just about the homes, it's about transport hub, it's about business and job opportunities, so you don't have to go into Edinburgh to work. It's about having opportunities there and getting businesses to invest in the Granton area. And we've actually done quite an interesting financial model around what's called outcomes-based finance, but it's essentially that Edinburgh use their borrowing powers and we pay some of the revenue of that so that they can, so that it's a partnership of getting the investment in a way it needs to be delivered, in the time frame it needs to be delivered. So it's an interesting way of getting more finance in, but in a way that works for both the local authority and for Scottish Government. And I think we'll probably see more of that type of investment. And so I think it is a good example of how to do kind of place.
I look forward to it.
Thanks very much, everyone. I think I've been working in economic development in Scotland for about 17 years now. You very often think we're just going round in circles. I think how we think about regional economies as an area with been genuine progress in over that time, but nevertheless the challenges remain quite profound, and I think it's showing hope this conversation continues over the so score's still 1-0,
It
I
is,
think.
it is,
So
must be a
rush off
time.
and catch it. Just ask you to thank the panel for their contribution.